Theodore Callahan had $41 to his name when he walked into that Somerville bank branch. He was holding a cracked debit card that had belonged to his dead mother, expecting nothing. What he got instead was a banker with shaking hands, a backroom conference call, and the beginning of the most devastating and redemptive 20 minutes of his life. But to understand what that card unlocked, you need to understand how a man with a corner office on the 22nd floor of a Boston skyscraper ends up with holes in his shoes, sleeping in his sister's guest room. Theodore grew up in Dorchester, the kind of neighborhood where you could hear your neighbor's television through the walls. His father, a transit mechanic, died of a heart attack when Theodore was 9 years old, collapsing in a maintenance yard on an ordinary Tuesday morning. After that, it was just his mother, Eleanor, his older sister, Claire, and him. Eleanor taught 5th grade for 31 years, clipped coupons, drove the same Buick for 14 years, and never once made her kids feel the weight of what they were missing. Theodore believed completely and without question that they were simply a working-class family who had gotten dealt a hard hand. He studied finance at UMass Boston on scholarships and loans, graduated with honors, and landed an analyst position at Sinclair Development Group, a powerful real estate firm that had been quietly reshaping Boston for over 60 years. That's where he met Evelyn Sinclair. She was the only daughter of the firm's chief executive and the granddaughter of its founder. Sharp, magnetic, the kind of woman who could walk into a room full of investors twice her age and own it within minutes. When she laughed at something Theodore said during a quarterly earnings review, he felt like he'd won something. Within a year, they were engaged. Within 2, they were married at a private club, overlooking the Charles River, in a ceremony that cost more than Eleanor Callahan made in 3 years of teaching. Eleanor sat in the second row in a clearance dress, while Evelyn's mother Constance introduced her to other guests, in a tone that made her social position unmistakably clear. For 9 years, Theodore told himself the class difference didn't matter. He had the title, the bigger office, the seat at meetings he wouldn't have reached that fast on merit alone. He ignored the way Constance corrected his grammar at dinner parties. He ignored the way Evelyn's friends asked what prep school he'd attended, and the flicker of something unkind when he said Dorchester Public Schools. He loved his wife. He loved the life, and that love made him willfully blind. About 18 months before the bank visit, things started shifting. Evelyn began staying at the office until 10, sometimes past midnight. Then came the closed-door phone calls, the trips to the bathroom with her cell, a new perfume he hadn't bought her. Some part of Theodore, the same part that spent his career finding lies hidden inside financial statements, knew something wasn't adding up, but he was terrified of what he'd find, because finding it meant doing something about it, and doing something about it meant risking the only life he'd built. The name that finally made it real was Grant Ashworth. Grant was the firm's chief financial officer, smooth, silver-tongued in his early 40s. He'd grown so close to Bradford Sinclair over the years that people had started quietly, calling him the son Bradford never had. Theodore came home early from a site visit one Thursday afternoon and found Evelyn's phone lit up on the kitchen island. 3 missed calls from Grant Ashworth. A text preview on the lock screen, "Can't wait for tonight." Same room at the Harbor View. He didn't confront her. Instead, he hired a retired Boston PD detective named Owen Marsh and asked him to find out everything. What Owen found took 3 weeks to compile, and about 4 minutes to destroy Theodore completely. 11 months of meetings at a seaport hotel, always cash, always careful. But it wasn't just an affair. Cross-referencing Owen's report with financial documents, Theodore quietly pulled from the firm's internal systems. A picture emerged that was far worse. Grant Ashworth had been taking out loans against properties the firm didn't have clear title to, funneling investor capital into Delaware shell companies, and using the difference to prop up 2 failing Cambridge developments that Bradford Sinclair had personally guaranteed. And Evelyn knew, not just about the affair but about the money. An email thread forwarded through her personal account discussed restructuring Theodore's role once the Cambridge projects closed. He was being planned out of his marriage and his career simultaneously by the same people. 6 weeks later, Evelyn slid divorce papers across the kitchen island like a lease agreement. "My father's lawyers drew this up months ago," she said. "There's really nothing to discuss. The prenuptial agreement Theodore had signed 9 years earlier, back when he was 28 and desperately in love and had no lawyer reviewing it for him, contained a clause stating that his position at Sinclair Development was considered a benefit of the marriage and not independent employment. Divorce meant termination. He had 72 hours to vacate the Beacon Hill townhouse, which had always been in Sinclair family money and had never been in his name. Constance Sinclair stood in the foyer watching him carry boxes down the stairs, arms crossed, and delivered the line that lodged itself permanently in Theodore's chest. "You always were a temporary arrangement, Theodore. I think you knew that. Evelyn didn't come downstairs to say goodbye. He moved into his sister Claire's guest room in Quincy with 4 boxes and a suitcase. His checking account had been quietly drained down to $1,100 over the preceding months through transfers he hadn't noticed because Evelyn had handled their joint finances. Then the job applications started and the rejections, because when your last employer is your ex-wife's family's firm and your termination came attached to a very public, very ugly divorce that half of Boston's real estate world had already gossiped about. References get complicated fast. He sold his watch. He sold a set of golf clubs. By the 5th week, he had $41 and was eating rice and eggs at Claire's kitchen table. It was Claire who pushed him toward the answer, though neither of them knew it at the time. On a Saturday afternoon, they finally started going through the boxes from their mother's house that had been sitting in Claire's garage for 3 years, untouched. Inside one, wrapped in their mother's winter scarf, was a shoebox. Inside the shoebox was a cracked old wallet, and inside the wallet was a debit card from a small institution called Somerville Savings and Trust. "Just see if there's anything left on it," Claire said, only half serious. "Buy yourself a coffee." They both laughed because the idea that Eleanor Callahan, the coupon-clipping schoolteacher, had left behind anything meaningful felt absurd. But Theodore had nothing left to lose. So the next morning he drove to the branch on Highland Avenue. The teller, a young woman named Priya Anand, took the card, typed for a moment, and went very still. She looked at the screen, then at Theodore, then back at the screen, then picked up her desk phone and said quietly into the receiver, "I need Mr. Delgado now." "It's a legacy trust flag." A man in his 50s came out of a back office within 90 seconds and walked Theodore into a private conference room. That's when Priya turned her monitor toward him, with hands that were visibly trembling. On the screen was an account balance of $3,211,000. Theodore stared at it, certain there was a decimal point in the wrong place. The branch liaison slid a business card across the table. "Margaret Doyle," he said, "senior partner at Doyle, Fitzgerald and Vance. She's been the trustee attorney on this account for over 20 years, waiting for exactly this moment. Call her before you leave the building." Theodore called from the parking lot, dropping his phone twice. Margaret Doyle didn't sound surprised. If anything, she sounded relieved. "Theodore Callahan," she said, "your mother told me you'd use that card eventually. Once you had nothing left to lose. She knew you better than you think." 2 hours later, Theodore sat across from a 71-year-old woman with silver hair in a State Street conference room. Margaret opened a leather folder and slid a sealed envelope across the table. His name was written on the front in his mother's handwriting, a handwriting he hadn't seen in 3 years. The letter began, "Theodore, if you're reading this, you finally used the card and I'm gone. And you're at the point where you need this more than your pride needs you to refuse it." Eleanor explained that her maiden name was Voss, not a name Theodore had ever had reason to investigate. Her father, Walter Voss, had co-founded a small development company in 1962 with a young, ambitious man named Harrison Sinclair. They called it Sinclair and Voss Development. They built it together from 2 rented desks in Cambridge, with $20,000 each. In 1968, Harrison Sinclair accused Walter Voss of embezzlement. Eleanor always believed the accusation was fabricated, engineered to force her father out, while he was recovering from a serious illness and couldn't fight back. Walter was bought out of his shares for a fraction of their value under threat of a public scandal that would have destroyed his family. But the lawyer, who drafted the original 1962 partnership agreement, had built in a small, easily overlooked class of preferred shares with a dividend reinvestment clause and anti-dilution protections. Sinclair Development had never bothered to revisit them because everyone assumed those shares had been extinguished. They hadn't been. 12% of the original founding equity had been sitting quietly in trust, compounding for decades. Eleanor had found the documents in her dying father's desk in 1998. She had gone to Margaret Doyle immediately. But Harrison Sinclair was still alive then, powerful and litigious, with a legal team that would have buried a schoolteacher in appeals for a decade. So Eleanor made a different choice. She let the trust sit. She let the dividends reinvest. She waited. She used to tell me, Margaret said, that someday her son would need this more than he needed to be told the truth. And she wanted the account to be so large and so undeniable that nobody could bury it the way they buried her father. Due to decades of compounding and the anti-dilution protections, the original stake had grown to represent approximately 21% of Sinclair Development Group's current outstanding equity, a company privately valued at around $240 million. 21% was more than enough. Combined with a handful of minority shareholders, Margaret had already quietly identified to force a full financial audit of the company. The same company that had just thrown Theodore out with $41 in his pocket. Claire cried when he told her. Then she asked the only question that mattered. What are you going to do with it, Theo? Because there's a version of this where you become exactly like them. Theodore thought carefully about his answer. He didn't want revenge for its own sake. But the fraud Grant Ashworth and Bradford Sinclair had been running wasn't just hurting him. It was going to hurt every pension fund and small investor who had trusted Sinclair Development with their retirement savings, the same way Harrison Sinclair had once taken Walter Voss's life's work and buried it. He and Margaret spent 3 weeks building the case methodically. A forensic accountant named Priscilla Wen confirmed everything Owen Marsh's investigation had suggested about the shell company transfers. They formally activated the trust position and reached out privately to 4 minority shareholders, longtime associates of Walter Voss's original partners who had never fully trusted Bradford Sinclair and had simply lacked the leverage to challenge him. Combined with Theodore's 21%, they controlled just over 38% of voting shares. Enough, under the company's own bylaws, to force an emergency shareholders meeting and demand an independent audit. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at a ballroom overlooking Boston Harbor, the same room where Sinclair Development had held its 60th anniversary gala 3 years earlier, an event Evelyn had planned down to the flower arrangements. Margaret had timed it deliberately to coincide with the company's annual investor dinner, when every board member, every major stakeholder, and both Grant Ashworth and Evelyn Sinclair would already be in the room. Theodore walked in wearing the first new suit he'd bought in 6 weeks. He watched Evelyn's face when she saw him, first confused, then annoyed, clearly assuming he'd come to make a desperate scene. Bradford Sinclair actually laughed, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, and said Theodore had some nerve showing up to beg for his parking spot back. Theodore walked to the stage and quietly asked the room for 5 minutes before the scheduled remarks. Then, without raising his voice, he explained everything. The trust established by his late grandfather, Walter Voss. The 21% equity stake the company's own founding documents confirmed had never been legally extinguished. The 38% voting coalition now standing beside him. And the documented evidence that Grant Ashworth had spent 2 years diverting investor capital through shell entities to prop up failing developments, personally guaranteed by Bradford. Sinclair. He watched Bradford's face go the color of the tablecloths. Grant stood so fast his chair clattered backward. Evelyn didn't move. She just stared at Theodore, and for the first time in 9 years, he watched real fear replace her composed mask. The room erupted the way rooms full of investors do when they realize their money might be disappearing. 2 of the firm's largest outside investors immediately seconded the audit demand, stating they'd had concerns about the Cambridge projects for over a year, but had lacked internal leverage to force transparency. Within 72 hours, the forensic audit went public. Within 3 weeks, the Massachusetts Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division opened its own inquiry. Grant Ashworth was placed on administrative leave, then terminated, then indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. Bradford Sinclair, facing both the fraud findings and a shareholder revolt, was forced to step down as chief executive within 2 months. Decades of quiet family control over the firm his father built, ending not with his own scandal exactly, but with the consequences of the one he had let happen, while dismissing Theodore as a temporary arrangement. Evelyn's world came apart almost as quickly. The Beacon Hill townhouse had been used as loan collateral in one of Grant's shell company arrangements, something Bradford had signed off on without telling his daughter, and it was seized as part of the asset freeze. Several of Evelyn's personal accounts, which the audit showed had received transfers from entities under investigation, were frozen pending review. Theodore saw her once more, outside the Suffolk County Courthouse, during an early hearing. She looked smaller and tired in a way money had always managed to hide before. She asked quietly whether he had planned all of it from the beginning, whether he had known about the trust the whole time and married her for it. He told her the truth. He had found out about his grandfather's stolen legacy the same week she handed him divorce papers over coffee. If anything, the timing proved how little he had ever understood about his own family, and how much his mother had quietly carried alone, waiting for the right moment to hand him the only thing she had left to give. Claire still lives in Quincy. She finally let Theodore help with her kids' college funds, after weeks of arguing that she didn't need it. Margaret Doyle is still downtown, and has become the closest living link Theodore has to understanding who his mother really was before he was born. He used a portion of the trust to establish a scholarship fund at the Quincy school where Eleanor taught for 31 years, named for her, for a woman who spent her whole life protecting the people she loved without ever once asking for credit. He took a controlling role at what remained of Sinclair Development Group, working alongside the investors who had helped him force the audit to rebuild the firm's reputation with the people Grant and Bradford had quietly betrayed. Because it turned out Theodore actually was good at that work. He always had been, even when he was made to feel like a guest in his own career, and sometimes on quiet Sunday mornings, he drives to the cemetery in Quincy, where Eleanor is buried next to his father, and he sits there for a while. And he tells her he finally understands why she kept that old cracked debit card active for 25 years, why she said nothing when he married into the very family that had stolen her father's name from the company he had built, why she waited and waited and waited until the moment he had nothing left to lose. She always did know him better than he knew himself. She just needed him to find out on his own.